So now, I have the honor of introducing you to an incredible human being who happens to be an amazing colleague and a cherished friend. You're going to have a chance to get to know Rydell in a few minutes, but I want to tell you about when I first met Rydell. It was in the aftermath of the pandemic. Rydell was the newly hired superintendent of a rural school district, and he was looking for a partner to support his district with equity work. Everything from helping create equity statements to addressing issues of inequity in district policies and practices. Now, when we work with school leaders, we do a little research. We want to get a sense of who the players are, what the issues are. And so I decided to look him up. And I did an old-fashioned Google search. And lo and behold, there he was, on YouTube, singing. I kid you not. He was singing. He was singing about a snow day. He was joyful, playing the piano, making snow angels, and letting his school community know that it was the first snow day of the year. I tell this story because it captures the spirit of who Rydell is as a human. Who we are is how we are. Rydell walks through this space with grace, passion, joy, and incredible, incredible wisdom. Would you please, ladies and gentlemen, and my friends beyond the binary, put your hands together for Rydell Harrison.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So I had to do a little bit of a dance just because my son is here, and why bring your 13-year-old son to a conference if you're not going to embarrass him? So I shall. So I'm really excited to be here. Just a couple of words. I just want to respond back to something that Carrie shared. This snow day video. I ended up just doing this video just for my community, the district where I was superintendent. And my brother called me that morning from Florida, and he was like, "Hey, what's this snow day video you just did?" And I was like, "How did you see it?" He said it was on Good Morning America. So it went viral. I often tell people that if you look at the number of views on YouTube, like 10,000 of them, I'm sure, are my mom. So I read an article recently that was about the 5 best ways to start a speech. Okay, so it wasn't exactly an article, it was a TikTok. And somehow my algorithm figured out that I had a speech coming up, and so I got all these videos about public speaking. So, according to this guy, one of the top 5 ways to start a speech is by asking a question. And so I thought, perfect, I asked really, really great questions. And then I started thinking, wait a minute, the audience that I'm talking to has undoubtedly sat through all kinds of PD about questions, DOK levels, higher order thinking, etc. And so then I started thinking, these are people who ask questions for a living, right? So I got to step up my game. Despite all the noise in the background of my thinking, I came up with a simple question that will frame our time together. What if every student, in every class, in every school, was thinking? Not compliant, not busy, not completing tasks, not waiting for the smartest student to answer, but thinking. Several years ago, I was leading professional development in Chapel Hill, Carrboro City Schools in North Carolina, where I had the privilege of working with Superintendent Tom Frisella. Tom had a habit that fundamentally changed the way I think about improvement. At least a couple of times a week, he would stop by my office and he would say something like, "Hey, Rydell, do you have a minute?" And I would respond, "Sure." And the answer was always sure, even if I didn't have a minute, right? Because that's what you do when it's your superintendent. So I said, "Sure, what's up?" And he said, "I was driving into work this morning, or I was in the shower, I was walking out of a meeting, and I started thinking, what if?" So he would always ask these what if questions and then just kind of leave it lingering out there. The what if was always an idea that was just beyond our current reality. What if teachers could move through professional learning at their own pace? What if we replace seat time requirements for PD with demonstrations of competency? What if? Those conversations were guided by one unspoken rule between Tom and I: suspend reality. That wasn't the time to talk about budgets, politics, contracts, or all the reasons something couldn't work. It was a space to explore what might be possible. After about 10 or 15 minutes, Tom would usually say, well, I don't want to keep you. I just wanted to throw that out there and see what you think. Those are some of my favorite conversations because they push me to think and to dream beyond the barriers that maintain our status quo. They push me to imagine what Stephen Johnson and Stuart Kaufman call the adjacent possible. This adjacent possible describes that space between reality and fantasy. It hasn't happened yet, but it's just within our reach. It's both desirable and it's feasible. The adjacent possible is not a fully realized future. It's the next possibility that becomes available to us because someone thought differently. So this morning, I'd like for you to explore with me the adjacent possible. Let's explore this reality that does not exist, but is within the realm of possibilities. What if every student, in every class, in every school, was thinking? Our ability to imagine the adjacent possible is directly tied to what we think people are capable of. These beliefs shape the boundaries of the adjacent possible, influencing what we're willing to believe and influencing what we're willing to explore and pursue. In other words, if we don't deeply believe that every student in every class in every school is capable of thinking, then we're unable to envision a future where that's true. So before we dream together this morning, I have two invitations. First invitation, let's try out that rule. Suspend reality. That's the first request, right? So press pause on that running loop that you might have in your head. This is impossible, like we couldn't do this. What about my principal who's gonna get on my nerves and I can't bring, all of that stuff. Just press pause, or at least turn the volume down. That's invitation number one. The second invitation that I want to bring you into is, I want us to set aside the common beliefs that are often limiting and constraining what we see as possibilities. One of my favorite prayers from the Bible is, I believe, help my unbelief. When I'm faced with the belief that some students are not capable of grade level work, help my unbelief. When I'm faced with the belief that poverty determines what students can achieve, help my unbelief. When I'm faced with the belief that multilingual learners must first master English before they can engage in complex thinking, help my unbelief. When I'm faced with the belief that students receiving special education services can't handle the same thinking tasks and intellectual demands as their peers, help my unbelief. When I'm faced with the belief that students of color are less interested, less motivated, less prepared for academic success, help my unbelief. And when I'm faced with the belief that performance gaps are evidence of limitations in our students rather than limitations of our systems, help my unbelief. So, we've suspended reality. We've got our unbeliefs in check. Now let's see where those two things take us. Imagine you're back in your classroom or back in your school preparing for your students to walk in. You've been living in this reality where every student in every class is thinking for a while now, so it's not new. So I want you to think, what does your classroom look like? What's different about your lesson? What's different about your expectations? What's different about you? I bet that what you just imagined was not simply a better math classroom. It was likely a different vision of school. And that's why I think that building thinking classrooms is way more radical than we might think it is. As you know, a thinking classroom is one in which students are doing the intellectual heavy lifting rather than the teacher. Students are actively solving problems, discussing ideas, constructing meaning together. So what would happen if 50 million students spent 13 years in schools that expected them to think, to reason, to question, to challenge, to imagine, and collaborate every day in every classroom? What kind of adults would we produce? What kind of communities would they build? What kind of democracy would we inherit? I think this is a good time to pause and remind us that we are at the Building Thinking Classrooms Conference, not the Building Students Thinking Conference. And so why is that important? Because student thinking, ladies and gentlemen, is not the problem. Students are hardwired to think, to wonder, to explore, and to make sense of the world. And I learned this lesson over and over, but I want to take you back to this time. Several years ago, I was the principal of Sternberger Elementary School, an affluent elementary school in Greensboro, North Carolina. And like every school, we had students who seemed to know exactly how to find the edges of the adult's patience. For me, one of those students was Grayson. Oh, he looks so sweet, doesn't he? Second grade Grayson. Bright eyes, a face that told you he was probably thinking about something, but not necessarily what you wanted him to think about. Grayson was the kind of student that all of us as educators that we know well. He was almost always off task. He was often focused on the wrong thing, and when he was focused on the wrong thing, he had this unique ability to bring a few other of his students and peers with him. He wasn't malicious, though now that I recall, we did spend a lot of time in his second grade year and third grade year reading this book called How to Take the Grr Out of Anger. Anybody know that book? But he wasn't malicious. He wasn't trying to ruin anyone's day, but he had a gift up for noticing what adults were hoping that he would notice. So every now and then, Grayson would end up in my office. And on this particular day, he was sitting there with some work in front of him. I don't remember what the assignment was. I just remember that in my mind, the goal was really simple. Grayson needs to sit quietly, finish his work, and return to class. But Grayson was not focused on the work in front of him. Grayson was staring at the wall. And out of nowhere, he looked at me and asked, "What's a global citizen?" So on my wall, I had a framed copy of the school's mission statement. You guys know the kind of mission statement I'm talking about, right? The kind that's full of the language that we believe in, right? And also full of language that we never expect a second grade student to interrogate, right? It says something like, at Sternberger Elementary School, our mission is to develop global citizens and yada, yada, yada. That likely sounds similar to your mission statements. And so out of nowhere, when he asked what's a global citizen, I was caught off guard. I wish I could tell you that I immediately recognized this as a beautiful moment of student curiosity. I wish I could tell you that I leaned in with my full principal heart and said, "Grayson, what a profound question." I did not. My first response was much more ordinary than that. I said something like, "Grayson, what are you doing? You need to finish your work." Because in that moment, I thought I knew what he was supposed to be thinking about. He was supposed to be thinking about the assignment, right? He was supposed to be thinking about why he was back in my office again. He was supposed to be thinking about how to get himself back to class. But Grayson didn't let it go. He asked again, "What does it mean to be a global citizen?" So finally, probably with a little more impatience that I'd be proud of in my voice, I asked him, "Why are you asking me that?" And he pointed to the wall and he said, "It says it right there." So we started talking and I tried to explain to this second grader what we meant by global citizen. Someone who understands themselves or sees themselves as a part of the larger world. Someone who thinks beyond themselves, Grayson. Someone who recognizes that their choices affect other people. And as I'm explaining this to him, As I'm explaining this to him, Grayson has this aha moment on his face. And he goes, oh, like he figured something out. He goes, oh, so that's why Miss Powers taught us that lesson. What? Right? Then he starts explaining the lesson to me. He starts making connections between the words on the wall and the work his teacher had done in class. The kind of person the school said that they were trying to help him to become. We talked about these things. And I remember sitting there thinking, wait a minute, Grayson was thinking. He was thinking deeply. He was thinking across context. He was making meaning from the environment around him. He was connecting the adult language of the school's mission to his lived experience as a student. And I almost missed it. I almost missed it because it didn't look like the kind of thinking that I'd asked for in the moment. It didn't look like compliance. It didn't look like task completion. It didn't look like him just putting his head down and finishing the work that had traveled with him from the classroom to my office. But it was indeed thinking. In fact, it was the kind of thinking that adults in schools actually say that we want. He was interpreting language. He was making connections. He was testing the meaning, asking whether the words we put on the wall had anything to do with what actually had happened in the classroom. Now, this is Grayson today. And I know you all are thinking, but Rydell, you look so young. He looks so old. Thank you. After all these years, that conversation stayed with me. I remember it because it shifted my thinking. After talking with Grayson and realizing what second graders were capable of, I actually started bringing focus groups of students together to ask them about the mission statement and the other things besides global citizen that were after all the commas, and really got their feedback. And that started because a second grader who was in my office for being off task asked a question that I was not prepared to take seriously. That is the tension I want us to sit with just for a moment. Grayson was not lacking the capacity to think. He was thinking all along. But the adults around him, including me, have been trained to notice a very narrow version of thinking. We were good at noticing whether or not he was on task. We were good at noticing whether or not he was quiet. We were good at noticing whether he was disrupting others. But we weren't as good at noticing when he was making meaning, or at noticing when his mind was reaching for something bigger than the task in front of him. The tragedy is not that our students are unable to think. The tragedy is that too many of our students learn that school is not the place where their thinking is wanted. Human beings are born trying to make sense of the world. Before children enter school, they test ideas. They wonder, they reach, they ask, they revise, they try again. Students don't arrive in our classrooms needing to be convinced to think. They arrive as meaning makers. They are already trying to understand the world, read the room, test boundaries, make connections, ask questions, and most importantly, figure out where they belong. The issue is not whether or not students are hardwired to think. The issue is what happens when they spend years in classrooms that teach unthinking. We teach unthinking when we reward students for waiting. We teach unthinking when the fastest answer gets more attention than the deepest question. When we rescue students before they've had enough time to struggle. When we sort students into groups that quietly tell them who is expected to lead and who's expected to follow. We teach unthinking when students learn that the safest thing to do is copy the example and then follow the procedure and keep their uncertainty to themselves. We teach unthinking when compliance is mistaken for learning. And look, I'm not here to beat us up as educators. We don't do this because we're careless or because we don't love children. We don't do this because we wake up in the morning hoping to produce compliance. But because the culture of school rewards students for becoming good at waiting for the example, waiting for the directions, waiting for the hint, waiting for the teacher to confirm that the idea was good enough to share out loud. And after years of being trained to wait, students learn the lesson. They learn that school thinking is not always about sense making. Sometimes it's about guessing what the adults want. You've seen the classroom. Sometimes it's about getting through the task without being exposed. Sometimes it's about looking busy enough to be left alone. It's not a cognitive problem. That's a moral problem. Because when we teach students not to think, we're not just limiting their academic development. We are narrowing their sense of who they are and who they are allowed to become. And we would be naive to believe that this unthinking phenomenon impacts groups of students proportionally. Marginalized students are already surrounded by messages designed to limit who they believe they can become and what they are capable of. And if the world is reminding you on a daily basis that you're not good enough, the last thing that you want to do is come to school and have those messages reinforced. The more we teach unthinking, the more students begin to internalize what they believe that we believe about them. That's one of the central arguments in maximizing opportunities to learn. In maximizing opportunities to learn. In their new book, my colleagues Andrew, Tom, and Isabel remind us that teacher expectations do not simply shape what teachers decide to teach, who they call on, or how much support they provide. Teacher expectations also shape how students come to understand themselves as learners. Students are always reading us. They're reading our tone, they're reading our patience, they're reading the task we give them, they're reading how long we wait before stepping in, they're reading who gets trusted to struggle and who gets rescued, they're reading who gets asked the interesting question and who gets handed the simpler worksheet. And over time, they begin to make meaning of those patterns. Some students learn, my teacher thinks I can handle this. Others learn, my teacher thinks this hard work is for someone else. Some learn my ideas belong in this room. Others learn the safest thing I could do is stay quiet, copy, and wait. That's why unthinking is not just an instructional problem, it's an identity problem. It's a belonging problem. It's a power problem. Because in a classroom where students are not thinking, someone still is. Someone is making the decision, someone is interpreting the task, someone is deciding what counts as a good idea and what doesn't, someone is determining when to press, when to rescue, when to move on, and who is ready for complexity. Someone is doing that work, and too often that someone is the adult. So students just simply learn to wait, waiting for the problem to be explained, waiting for the first step, waiting for the hint. They wait for the student that everyone knows is really good at math. They wait for permission to trust their own reasoning. And that kind of waiting, ladies and gentlemen, is not neutral. It teaches students where intelligence lives in the room. It teaches them who owns the mathematics. It teaches them whether their ideas are necessary or merely tolerated. So when I say that we systematically teach students to stop thinking, I'm not saying educators don't care, but what I am saying is that our routines often teach students to surrender the intellectual authority before they've ever had a chance to claim it. That's why I think building thinking classrooms matters. Because BTC doesn't simply ask us to use different strategies, it asks us to examine the messages our classroom sends about who gets to think, who is expected to lead, whose ideas are worth being made public, and who's trusted with complexity. So let's break this down. First idea that I think is revolutionary. Random grouping isn't just clever, it's submersive. Random grouping looks simple, right? Put students with different people, keep the room moving, prevent them from always working with their friends. We can make it sound like a classroom management strategy, but underneath, something else is at work that's much more disruptive. Random grouping interrupts stories students have already learned about one another. It interrupts the story of who's good at math, the story of who should lead, who should follow, who should be copied, who should be ignored, who's safe to ask for help, and who's not expected to contribute at all. Because by the time our students walk into our classrooms, they're not just bringing their backpacks and Chromebooks, they're bringing years of social information. They know who gets called smart, they know who usually finishes first, they know who the teacher trusts, they know who gets placed in the high group and who gets pulled out. And if we're not careful, our group work can reproduce those same patterns. Students walk to the same people, they take up the same roles, the confident student explains, the quiet students write, the student with status leads, the students without status learn to survive by nodding along. Visibly random groups interrupt that pattern. It says, today you're not locked into yesterday's role. It also says that you don't get to assume who will carry the thinking. Today, you may find yourself standing next to someone whose brilliance you've not had a chance to notice yet. That's why I think random grouping is more than a participation strategy. It's a status intervention. It interrupts fixed hierarchies in the classroom. It rewrites who's supposed to be in charge. And it invites voices that have been historically sidelined while disabling supremacy as an organizing logic. These randomized groups are a bigger deal than maybe we think. Because the minute that you shift who you stand next to, you begin to shift who students believe themselves to be. Let's talk about the vertical whiteboard. Vertical whiteboards democratize visibility. What are you talking about? They're not just surfaces, they're public invitations. In a traditional classroom, student thinking is often hidden, right? It's hidden in notebooks, it's hidden in worksheets, half-finished scratch work, quiet conversations, and it's hidden in the minds of students who are not sure if it's safe to share their thoughts yet. And the thinking we do see is most often the most polished thinking. We see the student who raises their hand because they already have the answer first. We see the student who can explain really quickly and confidently, and most importantly, in the language of school, right? We see students who already know how to perform competence in ways that the adults know how to recognize. So vertical whiteboards change what becomes visible. It's not just the answer that's visible, it's the struggle, the false start, the crossed out idea, the diagram that almost worked, the student pointing at the board and saying, wait, what if we tried this? The group realizing that they need to back up and rethink what they've already done. That matters, right? Because students begin to understand that thinking is not something that happens after you know the answer. Thinking is the unfinished work of making sense. And when every group's thinking is visible, the classroom begins to send a different message. Not just the polished thinkers, not just the fluent English speakers, not just the confident kids, not just the students who have already learned how to sound mathematical. Everyone's thinking belongs in the room. Now, let's just take a moment and be honest. Visibility can feel risky. For some students, being visible has not always been safe. They've learned that public mistakes can become public embarrassments. They've learned that being wrong can confirm what people already say about them. They've learned that sometimes it's better to be invisible than it is to be exposed. So the whiteboard alone is not magic, because visibility without belonging feels like surveillance. But when visibility is paired with meaningful tasks, random groups, and a culture where unfinished thinking is treated as useful, students begin to see themselves differently. They can see themselves as contributors, not after they get the right answer, but in the act of grappling. They start to learn that my partial idea helps the group. My question might just move us forward. My mistake might reveal something important. My thinking doesn't always have to be perfect before it becomes public. And that is a powerful shift. And lastly, thinking tasks demand intellectual risks. This might be the most provocative part. Thinking tasks do not simply invite students to participate, they remove the hiding places that traditional schooling has made uncomfortable. They do not begin with, watch me, then copy, or I do, we do, you do. I knew you guys would know that. They don't allow students to survive by mimicking the example, filling in the blanks, or waiting for the teacher to reduce all of the uncertainty. Thinking tasks place students in front of complexity before the adult has made it safe. That is risky. It's risky because students have to try something before they know whether it will work. They have to say something before they know whether it's right. They have to depend on one another before they know who has the answer. They have to stay with the confusion long enough for meaning to emerge. And for students who have learned that struggle is dangerous, that is not a small task. Many students have learned that being wrong is evidence. It's evidence that you're not good at math, or evidence that you really don't belong in this group. It's evidence that you should just stay quiet the next time. Thinking tasks interrupt that story. They say you're allowed to encounter complexity now. You're allowed to reason before every step has been laid out and explained. You're allowed to try something that may not work, or to struggle without that struggle being used as evidence against you. In that sense, the task is communicating before the teacher even says a word. It's telling them that your thinking actually does matter, that your ideas are worth exploring. This classroom is a place where your voice cannot hide. And more importantly, it doesn't have to. And that's why this work, for me, I believe it's bigger than math routines. Because when we invite young people to think, we're inviting them to take up space. Not just physical space at the board, but intellectual space, relational space, public space. The space to offer an idea or to challenge someone else's idea, the space to be wrong, but also then stay in the conversation, the space to influence what happens next. And that, folks, is power. Not power as domination, but power as agency. One of my colleagues, Tisha Marquette, has been thinking a lot about this idea of student agency and what that could look like in the classroom. Some great opportunities for you if you want some additional learning on that idea after. To be clear, BTC doesn't eliminate adult power, but it does reorganize power. The teacher is still the one designing the conditions, choosing the task, monitoring the room, consolidating the learning, but the difference is that students are no longer positioned only as receivers of adult thinking, they're positioned as producers of meaning. So if unthinking teaches students to wait for power, then thinking teaches them to practice power. They practice power by using their voice, believing that their ideas can enter a room and change what happens next. So what would the redistribution of power look like if every student in every class in every school was thinking? Power? Okay, Rydell, you went too far. Now, I know that this is a math conference, so some of you may be thinking, Rydell, look, I came for the vertical whiteboards, and how did we get to power? But that's exactly the point, right? This is the brilliance, I believe, of BTC, is that it looks like a set of instructional practices, but underneath those practices is a different arrangement of authority. Students are no longer only receiving adult thinking, they're producing this meaning and testing out their own ideas, and that is power. In our book, Equitable School Improvement, Isabel Stevenson and I argue that meaningful improvement requires more than just better strategies, better data cycles, or better implementation plans. It requires a shift in power. Not power as a thing that adults give away or students take from us, but power is something that we learn to share differently. Power is the ability to name what's happening, to make meaning of experiences, and to influence what comes next. And that's where BTC opens up a much bigger conversation. Because if students practice power in the classroom, eventually we have to ask ourselves, is that power going to travel beyond the task? Do their ideas only matter when they're solving the math problem, or do their ideas matter when we're trying to understand our schools? This is the part that we're trying to name in our book. Schools are consistently being shaped by outside pressures, state tests, board goals, district initiatives, new mandates, public narratives. But if those are the only forces that are shaping our decisions, then we're missing the people who experience our systems directly. We're missing out on their experiences and what we can learn from them. Students know things about our schools that we can't know from our side of the desk. They know where belonging feels real and where it feels performative. They know which routines build confidence and which ones quietly communicate, this was not designed for you. So the question becomes, once students begin thinking in our classrooms, are we willing to listen to what they are thinking about their schools? Over the last couple of years, Carrie and I have been thinking a lot about student voice and its power to transform our schools. Here's how we describe student voice: as the intentional inclusion of students' perspectives, experiences, and insights in the decisions that shape their own learning, school culture, and overall educational experience. This idea of student voice rests on a simple belief. Students are experts in their own experiences and essential partners in creating schools that are more just and more responsive. Now, that's the academic version that Carrie and I give. But when we're working with educators from across the state in our student voice workshop, or we're supporting districts who are implementing and incorporating student voice into their improvement work, we simply let patience do the talking. This is Patience. Patience was a student in Bristol Public Schools, one of the districts we work with as they were bringing student voice as part of their continuous improvement work. She, along with several other students, were invited to participate in a guiding coalition of teachers, leaders, and district stakeholders. The goal wasn't simply to find out what students thought, but really to get their input and have them work with the adults on developing a future that is more in line with their experiences and what we hope that they experience. The goal was to bring students into the work of understanding the system and also what came next. And this matters because Patience had experienced the more familiar versions of student voice, right? She filled out the surveys, she responded to the forms, all of those things, but this felt really different. So in this video, she describes what it felt like to be asked for her input as part of the guiding coalition. And before I start the video, I want you to listen for one word as she's talking. Listen for the word actually, and what she means by the word actually.
Last year, during my junior year, I was invited to be part of this group that at the Board of Ed, we, including faculty, students, and teachers from all the different schools in our district, came together and talked about the schools in our district and what the issues were, what we needed to fix, ideas that were already on the table, and just like the school atmosphere in general. And when I first got the invitation, I was actually really excited because obviously our schools have forms and surveys that we fill out to help them try to navigate the changes that they think they should be made in schools. But I felt like I was actually physically helping my school since I was going to be with a group of people and my voice was actually going to be heard with the tone and diction that I intended it in. And I could be more specific if needed, which you can't do in a survey. And we sat and we really talked about our schools and the different issues that we have and the different solutions that were on the table and everything else. And it made me really excited because I felt like I could actually see the physical change happening in my school, whereas with surveys and forms, I didn't really see that. And that made me feel closer to my school community and a real part of my school community. And it made me feel an active member of my school community, more importantly, since my voice was heard and action was taken. It was something that I could actually see. So I think student voice is really important. Thank you.
And we actually love her. What strikes me most about Patience is not simply that she felt heard, it's that she felt useful. She felt like her thinking mattered to the life of the school. She wasn't just reflecting on the system, she was helping the system understand itself. So what happened if every student was thinking that way? What happened if every student was thinking? Maybe they would get better at math. I believe they would. But maybe something bigger would happen too. Imagine a school where it's not a privilege, but thinking is not a privilege, but a daily expectation. Where students see themselves as people having ideas that belong in public, where they believe their questions matter. Where student ideas guide adult learning, where students become co-creators, not just passengers. And maybe the real transformation is not only what happens to students when they begin thinking, but maybe the real transformation is what happens to us when we're finally ready to listen. And that brings us back to where we started. What if every student in every class in every school was thinking? The future we've been imagining this morning is not a fantasy. It's not some distant version of school that lives beyond our reach. It's adjacent. It's close enough to glimpse, close enough to name, close enough to begin building. But it requires a commitment from each and every one of us. So as you move through this conference, as you sit in sessions, stand at whiteboards, wrestle with tasks, listen to colleagues, and think about your own students, I want to invite you to hold on to the adjacent possible. Maybe even create a section in your conference notes labeled adjacent possible. Use that space to imagine. What might become possible if every student was thinking? What does it really mean to think? Not just complete the work, not just follow directions, not just get answers, but actually think. And what are you willing to let students change in you because of their thinking? Because the call to action is not about only building thinking classrooms, it's about becoming the kind of adults who are willing to be changed by the students who think in them. And I'll admit, part of why this matters to me so much is because my son Seth, who's 13, is here today. Like every parent, I want him to learn mathematics. I want you to learn mathematics. I also want you to show your work. Guys, when you see my son Seth, will you remind him the importance of showing his work and keeping his work ordered? Okay. Like every parent, I want him to learn, but more than that, right? I want him to become the kind of person who asks good questions, thinks deeply, and believes that his ideas matter. And if that's what I want for Seth, I can suspect that every one of you also wants that for your students. And I hope that we get there really soon. Thank you, guys.